Okay, so now we get to that part of church history where we start to deal with the really controversial stuff. The stuff over which more blood and ink has been spilled and continues to be spilled than almost anything else to do with Christianity. The Crusades. We closed off last session with the split between the Eastern Orthodox Church of the Byzantine Empire and the Roman Catholic Church of the West, but pointed out that at the time it wasn't seen as such a big deal that these excommunications had been flung around. As we will see, relations between the West and the East were actually still quite strong enough to muster one of the largest military and people movements of European history. But the events around the Crusades would lead to an even deeper souring of relations, including, ultimately, the most stupid and greatest betrayal of all time, not including, obviously, Judas betraying Jesus. Now, it is easy to take just one narrative when it comes to the Crusades and run with it and let that colour everything. Whether that is that it was all about a religious war, that it was self-defence, that it was unprovoked aggression, that it was a battle of ideologies, or even that actually it had almost nothing to do with Christianity at all. All of which actually have a lot of merit to them when taken together in the wider context of Europe and the Middle East of the time. So what I propose to do, because this is such a huge topic, is actually spend quite a few sessions looking at the Crusades. Firstly, we'll look at the background to the First Crusade and some of how it began. And then we'll spend some time looking more closely at the rest of the First Crusade, and the Second, the Third, the Fourth, the Fifth, the Sixth, the Seventh, the Eighth, and final Crusade, which ended in 1272, although we'll mainly be looking at the first four. And of course then we have the fall of the final remnant of the Crusader states in 1291. But if you think that is all that the Crusades were, then you're mistaken. This is all part of a much larger narrative across Europe, and there were 3 other crusading spheres going on at this time, which we will also look at after focusing on those to the Holy Land. There was, of course, the Reconquista of Spain from the Al-Andalus Muslim states. There were the Northern Crusades against the Pagans and later the Eastern Orthodox Christians of Russian Novgorod. Finally, there were the Crusades within Europe, within Western Europe, against heretical sects of Christians, such as the Cathars in the Albigensian Crusade in southern France, another crusade against those who were seen as somehow favouring or supporting those heretics in Milan, and other such crusades ending ultimately in the early 1400s, where there were 6 failed crusades launched against the proto-Reformation Hussites in Bohemia. Which means, as you can see, there's quite a lot to cover here on this topic of crusades, and it helpfully leads us right up to the doorstep of the Reformation itself. So what was going on with the First Crusade, as it is generally called? What was the state of things leading up to it? Why did it come about? How did it come about? And what was happening as it started to get going? Okay, let's have a think about the state of the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire. Islam had conquered Jerusalem and the Levant in 638, just 6 years after Muhammad had died, and they quickly conquered the rest of the Levant. They went down into Egypt, across North Africa, and conquered nearly all of Visigothic Spain. They then invaded into France and were only pushed back there, as we heard before, in 732 by our good Frankish friend Charles Martel. At that point, they had long since conquered the Persian Sassanid Empire, the ancient enemies of the Byzantines, based around modern-day Iran and spreading much further to the east. And so Islam had also spread into modern-day Afghanistan and the other Central Asian nations like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. By the late 11th century, the time of the Crusades, we even have Muslim gravestones in Indonesia. Those trade routes across the southern area of Eurasia, going from the Holy Land and Saudi Arabia, around India, down into Indonesia, being key routes through which Islam would be spread. But from the moment of Muhammad's death, there was a dispute over who should take over, with one group saying his successor should be Abu Bakr, who was the father-in-law of Muhammad and arguably his closest companion and advisor. These people are called the Sunnis. And the other group was saying the successor should have been someone called Ali, who was a cousin and son-in-law of Muhammad. These people are known as Shia Muslims. Now, multiple battles took place between the Sunni and the Shia in 650 onwards until the Battle of Karbala, when the death of the son of Ali would finally divide Islam pretty much once and for all. Today, this sectarian conflict continues with Shia Iran and Sunni Saudi Arabia fighting endless proxy wars across the Muslim world. And of course involved in that are things like America and NATO, who are allied with Sunni nations like Saudi Arabia and Turkey, and Russia, which has allied itself with Iran and the support of Iran going into the conflict in Syria, and so on and so on. This is a real issue in the world today. And there continue to be bombings in mosques in Syria and Iraq and Pakistan and Afghanistan and elsewhere as these different groups attack each other violently, not just on a national level, but a local level as well. And that's before we even get into the other kinds of Islam, which would come along later. Even at the time of the Crusades, therefore, the Muslim world was heavily divided by both theology and by politics. Shortly before the First Crusade, this was the state of Europe and Islam. Hopefully you can all see this map. What do we have here? And of course you've got England over here, you've got France, you've got Normandy with the Normans, you've also got the Normans here in southern Italy and Sicily. You've got the Kingdom of France. You've got the Reconquista happening in Spain as these Christian kingdoms are pushing back the Muslims southward. You've got the Holy Roman Empire, which is controlling pretty much all of Italy at this point, including Rome. You've got the important kingdom of Hungary, which we will be looking at in a moment. You've got the Novgorodian Rus, and you've got the Byzantine Empire, which at this point has been forced back all the way out of modern-day Anatolia and Eurasian Turkey, and they only control a tiny sliver of land in Asia and this part of Greece and modern-day Turkey. They also have control of Cyprus. What else is going on though is you see this huge empire, the Great Seljuk Turk Empire, which is something quite new on the scene. They originated in the steppes over here around the Aral Sea. They came down, they conquered the Persian heartlands of Islamic control, continued over. They had a major battle we're going to hear about against the Byzantines, forced the Byzantines out of Anatolia. They spread down, and these Turks are Sunni, and they're going to have a fight with the Shia Fatimid Caliphate, who used to control all of North Africa and Egypt and Jerusalem and the Holy Land, but have slowly been losing control as the Normans took Sicily and attacked into northern Africa. As the Turks take over the Holy Land, the Fatimids are certainly on the wane. But this is the key issue. The Byzantine Empire has been forced out of Anatolia. Bear in mind that there's still a holdout here of Armenian, Cilician Christians, and the Kingdom of Georgia is going to cause headaches for the Turks as well, so it's not all smooth sailing. But this is a real threat right on the doorstep of Europe. And as we could see, there were conflicts between especially the Seljuk Turks and the Fatimid Empire. So the Seljuk Turks, hailing from the steppes near the Aral Sea, had conquered the majority of Islam in the Persian heartlands. They adopted Sunni Islam in their westward expansion, and they brutally crushed the Byzantine Empire's armies at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. The Turks would go on to conquer nearly all of modern-day Turkey, except for the European side around Constantinople and a tiny sliver of land on the other side of the Bosporus. But they'd also clash with the Shia Fatimids, and by this time they would conquer in 1073 they would take Jerusalem and Damascus from the Fatimids in 1073. So, having lost their traditional heartland of Anatolia, most of modern-day Turkey, full of Christians, not Muslims, bear that in mind, the Byzantine Empire was in deep trouble. And reports were starting to come in that ever since the Seljuk Turks had taken Jerusalem, pilgrims to Jerusalem and Bethlehem and the Holy Land were being harassed and having difficulty which they hadn't faced under the Fatimids, who were much more accommodating of Christians in their lands, being quite used to a large number of Christians in Egypt. But in 1092, the ruler of the Seljuk Empire died, and the empire ended being split up between his brother and his 4 sons, and later their sons, and this once monolithic power controlling all of this land was suddenly divided and fighting among itself. You had the area around Rum, being the Seljuk Turkate of Rum. Then you had different groups here in the Holy Land. You had different groups over here, different group here. And then that split in two, and this split in two. And the whole thing was an absolute mess. That happened in 1092. Now, the ruler of the Byzantine Empire from 1081 was a shrewd and talented man known as Alexius I Komnenos. And he would oversee a military, financial, territorial, cultural, religious restoration of the fortunes of the empire by delicate diplomacy, generous and genius generalmanship, and superb statesmanship. It was this emperor who appealed to the Pope in 1095 for aid against the Turks, expecting some money, some resources and weapons, and a couple of thousand well-trained troops. What he got, well, that was something else entirely. Now, the Pope he asked for help was Pope Urban II, who was living in France at the time, because he'd had a big falling out about who was really in charge of things with the Holy Roman Emperor. And that had led to the Holy Roman Emperor kicking him out of Rome with an army after a battle and installing an anti-pope to rule in his place. Something the people of France and most of Europe weren't willing to recognise. So, at the 10-day Council of Clermont, Urban gave a speech full of power and rhetoric to rouse the French nobles and the church figures to support the idea of a crusade, along the lines of what had been successful during the Reconquista and its ongoing progress in Spain. Now, the speech contained a lot of dubious claims about suffering of Christians in the Holy Land and the need for an armed undertaking to reclaim it for Christendom. Bear in mind it had been lost to the Muslims 400 years ago. But it also contained a new radical deviation on a developing doctrine of indulgences and the power of the Pope to forgive sins. For a few centuries, the Western Church had been building a theology very alien to the Bible and the early church, including the idea that Christians weren't truly saved into heaven unless they did enough good works to outweigh their sins during their life on earth. If you had more sins than good works, instead you had to pay off those sins in purgatory through grueling labour and suffering and burning and torture until you were cleansed of your sin, you paid them off and you were worthy enough to enter into heaven. Now, those saints in this life who were super holy and had an abundance of good works above and beyond what they needed to never go to purgatory, these are things which are known as works of supererogation. It's a fancy word which I quite like the sound of. These abundance of good works above and beyond what they needed were understood to be placed almost like golden ingots or coins into a divine treasury of favour for God. And it could be given and dispensed, these golden ingots of good deeds, to those who wanted them to get them time off purgatory, to help try and balance out their good versus bad works. Now, the Pope, and only the Pope, had the power to dispense what were known as indulgences, this giving of these works of supererogation, these good works of the saints. And he did so for acts of pilgrimage and faith, but at this stage not really something that was being done for money. But the fear of purgatory or even hell weighed very heavily on the minds of soldiers and knights and even peasants in Western Europe, especially the former because it was literally their job to murder and kill people, which is a pretty serious sin. So the Pope made the radical move of suggesting that they could actually put their killing and murdering to good use and earn a complete and total indulgence from all their sins and murdering and killing if they went on Holy Crusade to retake Jerusalem and help the Byzantines and were either successful or died trying. Now bear in mind that these people were not people who had ever read the Bible. They hadn't had much interaction with it. The teaching of the church was clearly well off the reservation on this kind of thing. But they had a real fear of purgatory and hell, and this was giving them a way into paradise without any more suffering. And there was plenty enough suffering in the world at that time. So the Pope gives this big speech, and then there's silence. Stunned silence. And then one French knight cries out, "Deus vult!" Latin for God wills it. And then another person cries out, "Deus vult!" and another, "Deus vult!" until the whole council hall is filled with the chanting of "Deus vult! Deus vult! Deus vult!" God wills it. The First Crusade had begun. But Urban wasn't a moron. And he knew that it would take time to gather the armies together of the various princes and barons, and you had to leave at the right time of year, just after the early harvest, so you had enough food on your journey throughout Eastern Europe, down through Hungary to Constantinople, or along Italy and over the Adriatic Sea. And so although this council took place in 1095, the Pope didn't plan on the Crusade force even leaving France and Western Europe until the 15th of August 1096. Enter the idiot who messed things up and made clear how unchristian and wicked much of this endeavour was, and how ignorant people were to be involved in it. And yet, ironically, the man who probably ensured the success of the whole crusade. That idiot was called Peter the Hermit. Peter, how do I put this, was a fanatic and a hysteric who went around the countryside of France gathering tens of thousands of mainly peasants, including women and children, and a few minor knights and trained soldiers, into a vast, unorganised crusade pilgrimage thing, heading to Constantinople and then on to Jerusalem. And he left in the early spring, when there was no food. Meanwhile, a rotten character named Emiko began gathering a similar such people's crusade in northern Germany and the Rhineland. And his people got rather bored of this idea of many, many months of walking through Europe, when there's Jews on the doorstep who don't accept Christ and who they believe all these false tales on about them killing Christian children and poisoning wells. And so you have the Rhineland massacres, where thousands and thousands of Jews, men, women, children were killed by these people's crusades throughout the Rhineland and parts of France. Some bishops tried to hide and defend Jews in their cities, even in their own homes, and in return were attacked and had their houses torched. The wider church, including the Pope, condemned these attacks on the Jews, but it remains a classic example of popular Christian anti-Semitism in this era. Likely, about 10,000 Jews were killed, up to a third of the Jewish population of Germany and northern France. Between Emiko and Peter the Hermit, the violence and pillaging, mainly for food because the people they brought along were literally starving, caused chaos in Christian Europe, such that as they headed to the borders of Hungary and into Hungary, they were pillaging the kingdom, desperate for food and money and gold. And they even burnt the city of Belgrade to the ground. Because of this, the King of Hungary had had enough. Emiko's crusade was utterly destroyed by the Hungarian army, and he went home, while the few who remained would join up with the tens of thousands that Peter had brought. Eventually, after a number of battles losing a number of people, Peter's crusade reached the edge of the Byzantine Empire near Niš in modern Serbia. Following a setting on fire of a mill by some German peasants during this crusade on the outskirts of Niš, things got out of hand, and the Byzantine garrison, who these crusaders were supposed to be coming to help, had to leave the fortified city and killed 10,000 of these people's crusaders. The remaining 30,000 were encouraged on their way to Constantinople and told to behave. Now, Emperor Alexius was expecting a well-trained army the following year, and at first he didn't know what to do with 30,000 starving, mainly peasants, on his doorstep. And so in the end he decided to feed them, all of them, for days, even if necessary for a year. And he gave them the choice of either waiting for the main force to come from the rest of Europe the following year, or he would give them boats and help them to go across into Turkish territory, despite it being clear that that would be near certain death. They chose the latter. Like I said, Peter the Hermit was an idiot, and they were ferried across the Bosporus. There they split into largely national groups, and they pillaged and they killed the local people, who were all Eastern Orthodox Christians, not that they cared. And then the Turkish army was waiting for them, and killed all but a few thousand of the 30,000 who crossed over. Some were imprisoned, a number, including some of the leaders, were converted to Islam. Clearly, Jesus wasn't everything for them. Hearing about the dire straits of what was happening from Peter the Hermit, who had lost control of what was going on and headed back to the emperor to try and get help, Emperor Alexius sent a relief force to the abandoned castle in which the few remaining survivors were stuck and dying because there was no access to water. He attacked and defeated the surrounding Turkish army, and he rescued the survivors. An act he really didn't need to do, but he was a pretty top bloke, to be honest. So far, all the Crusade has managed to do was kill about 10,000 Jews, thousands of Christians in Hungary, thousands of Christians in Anatolia, and got about 38,000 mainly peasants, women, children, and a few knights killed in the People's Crusade. Killed mainly by the Turks, but also by the Hungarians, by forces in Germany trying to protect the bishops who were trying to protect the Jews and others, and by the Byzantines. Not a great start. Ironically, though, the sheer ineptitude of the People's Crusade may be what paved the way for the success of what we will talk about next session, the Prince's Crusade.